I've spent a decade observing how the human ego reacts when it finally hits a wall it cannot climb over, a wall built of simple, unyielding integrity. Most of us understand that a badge represents a boundary, a line drawn in the sand of our civil society. But for some, a badge is nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a fly to be swatted away by the sheer weight of a bank balance or a powerful last name. Nothing in my years of analyzing human behavior prepared me for the cold, calculated arrogance that Tiffany Sterling displayed on a humid Tuesday afternoon in West Palm Beach. She wasn't just breaking the law, she was performing an act of class warfare from the driver's seat of a $250,000 Italian sports car. She didn't look at the officer as a human being or a protector of the peace. To her, Officer Miller was a servant who had forgotten his place, a commoner who dared to interrupt the rhythm of a Sterling. If you've ever felt that burning sensation in your chest when you see someone believe they are fundamentally better than you because of their father's jet, then you need to hear every word of what happened next. Because Tiffany Sterling was about to learn that while money can buy a car that reaches 200 miles per hour, it cannot outrun the shadow of a father who has finally decided that enough is enough. What happened when Tiffany reached for her gold-plated phone wasn't just a phone call, it was a detonator. In the next few minutes, the very foundation of her untouchable life will begin to crumble, proving a truth I have shouted from the rooftops for 10 years. Your privilege is only as strong as the person willing to tolerate it. And on this day, tolerance had reached its absolute limit. The episode on this incident is a masterclass in the collapse of an elite ego. It began with a simple traffic stop for reckless driving, but it evolved into a psychological battle that will change two families forever. Tiffany didn't just mock the law, she tried to erase the man standing behind it. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't possibly have imagined, was the black SUV pulling up behind them, carrying the one man she thought was her ultimate shield. Stay with me, because the moment the back door of that SUV opened, the expression on Tiffany's face shifted from a smirk of triumph to the specific hollow stare of someone who realized, for the first time in 24 years, that the safety net had been cut. This is a story about the day the Sterling name stopped being a passkey and started being a prison. The flashing blue lights in the rearview mirror of a custom-painted Ferrari usually signal a moment of realization for most people. A realization that, for a few seconds, the rules of the road have caught up to them. But for Tiffany Sterling, those lights were nothing more than a flickering annoyance, an interruption to her afternoon plans that could be fixed with a sharp tone and the right last name. Officer Miller, a man whose face was a map of 20 years of public service, lined with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the best and worst of humanity, approached the driver's side. He didn't see a billionaire's daughter. He saw a vehicle that had just clocked 95 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone, weaving through traffic as if the other drivers were merely obstacles in a video game. When the window rolled down, the air that escaped the car didn't just smell of expensive French perfume. It was thick with a toxic level of condescension. Tiffany didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at his badge number with a smirk that I've seen on 100 untouchable faces, the kind of look that says, I already know how this ends, and you're the one who lost. Do you have any idea how much this car costs? She started, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that felt like a slap. She didn't offer her license. She offered a golden credit card as if it were a universal get-out-of-jail-free pass. My time is literally worth more than your annual salary, officer, so let's skip the lecture and the paperwork. Just write whatever little number you need to write and let me get back to my life. Officer Miller didn't flinch. For a man who had spent decades protecting people from the consequences of their own recklessness, this wasn't his first encounter with an ego that had grown too large for its surroundings. He spoke with the steady, unhurried cadence of a man who knows that the law doesn't have a price tag. License and registration, ma'am, and please step out of the vehicle. The silence that followed was heavy. It was the specific silence of a privileged world being told no for the first time. Tiffany's expression shifted. The boredom disappeared, replaced by a sharp, jagged anger. This was the moment she decided to use her father's name as a weapon, not realizing that a weapon is only dangerous until someone braver decided to take it away. You're making a career-ending mistake, she hissed, reaching for her phone. My father is Arthur Sterling. He's played golf with your commissioner every Sunday for 5 years. One word from me, and you'll be directing traffic in a school zone by tomorrow morning. Do you understand who you're talking to? Miller looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the wrinkles of anger forming on a young face that had never known hardships. He thought of his own daughter, working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school, and he felt a wave of profound disappointment. "I understand exactly who I'm talking to," he replied, repeating the very words that have echoed in every hallway of justice for a century. "I'm talking to a driver who put lives at risk. Now out of the car, now." As she stepped out, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt, she began filming him with her phone, laughing into the camera about harassment and small-town power trips. She was performing for her followers, but she was blind to the black SUV that had quietly pulled back over 50 yards behind them. She was so focused on humiliating the man in front of her that she didn't hear the heavy door of that SUV slam shut. As Tiffany leaned against her car, the arrogance in her posture began to fray at the edges. Officer Miller didn't look impressed by her filming. In fact, he looked like a man watching a storm gather on the horizon, not with fear, but with the steady, calm focus of someone who had already secured the shutters. She dialed the number she had used 1,000 times to make problems disappear. To her, this wasn't a call for help. It was an activation code. She put it on speaker, a classic move for someone who wanted to broadcast their influence. "Dad, you need to call the commissioner right now. There's a power-tripping officer here who's harassing me. He's going to make me late for the foundation lunch, and he's being, frankly, rude." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence so sharp it felt like a razor blade cutting through the humid Florida air. Tiffany expected the familiar, comforting roar of her father's voice, the one that usually promised to handle it. Instead, she heard a sound that didn't belong in her world, a heavy, weary sigh. "Tiffany," Arthur Sterling said, his voice stripped of the warmth she was accustomed to. "Where are you exactly?" "I'm on 4th and Main near the hardware store. Just tell the commissioner to get this guy off my back. I'm not going to be intimidated by a uniform." "Stay exactly where you are," Arthur replied, and the line went dead. Tiffany blinked, confused. She looked at her phone, then at Miller, who had remained standing by the trunk of her car, hands resting on his belt, watching her with a look of quiet intensity. She expected a squad car to arrive, lights blazing, to whisk her away from this injustice. Instead, the street grew strangely quiet. The afternoon traffic seemed to slow down, as if the entire block was holding its breath. Then, the black SUV that had been idling behind them began to roll forward. It didn't drive like a police cruiser or a delivery van. It moves with the deliberate, heavy grace of an armored vehicle. The driver's side door opened. Out stepped Arthur Sterling. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was in casual attire, his face drawn tight, his eyes scanning the scene not with the warmth of a father, but with the cold, diagnostic precision of a man who had spent his life building an empire and was now realizing there was a crack in the foundation. Tiffany's smile finally disappeared. She stepped towards him, a rehearsed sob ready to bloom, her script of victimization prepared. "Dad, finally, this officer is determined to—" Arthur didn't even look at her. He walked past her as if she were a ghost. His eyes locked onto Officer Miller. For a moment, the world of the billionaire and the world of the officer, two spheres that rarely touched unless it was on the billionaire's terms, collided. The air was thick with the weight of expectation. Tiffany waited for the explosion of anger directed at Miller. She waited for her father to demand an apology, to threaten Miller's job, to demand the badge number for the last time. Instead, Arthur stopped 3 feet from Miller, took off his glasses, and looked at the ground for a second. When he looked up, the billionaire facade, the one that had bought influence, silence, and immunity, wasn't there. He looked exhausted. He turned slowly toward his daughter, and in that movement, the shield she had relied on for 24 years simply disintegrated. Arthur Sterling didn't shout. He didn't gesticulate. He didn't do any of the things Tiffany had seen him do in boardrooms or at political fundraisers when he was displeased. He simply stood there, a man of immense influence, looking at his daughter with a gaze that felt like a cold, surgical blade. It was a look of profound, quiet disappointment, the kind of look that hits harder than any lecture. "Tiffany," he said, his voice level and devoid of the indulgence she was used to, "do you have any idea why I am here?" Tiffany's bravado cracked. She had expected a rescue, a shouting match, a display of power that would make Miller bow his head. Instead, she was getting a masterclass in accountability that she was entirely unprepared for. "Dad, stop it. This man, he's been treating me like a criminal. Tell him who you are." Arthur looked at the badge on Miller's chest, then back at his daughter. "I know exactly who he is, Tiffany. He is a public servant doing exactly what he is paid to do, and I know exactly who you are too. You are my daughter, but you are currently behaving like a stranger. For the last 5 years, I have indulged your arrogance because I thought it was just youthful fire. I thought you would grow into the responsibility that comes with our name. I was wrong." The words hung in the air, heavier than the summer heat. Tiffany's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was watching her world shift on its axis. The man she viewed as her ultimate weapon was forced to fire. "I am not here to interfere in the law," Arthur continued, turning to Miller with a subtle, respectful nod. "Officer, I apologize for my daughter's behavior. I will ensure that she complies with every instruction you have given her. If there are citations, she will pay them. If there is a court appearance, she will be there. And I want to be very clear. I will not be using any influence to mitigate the consequences of her actions today. In fact, I would prefer that the law treat her exactly as it would treat anyone else." Tiffany felt the ground move under her feet. She looked at her father, searching for a sign that this was a performance, a strategic play to appease the officer before they went home. But there was no twinkle in his eye. There was no secret wink. He was turning his back on the very system of favors he had built over decades. "Dad, you can't be serious," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is going to be in the papers. You'll be ruined." "I have spent 30 years building a reputation," Arthur replied, his voice chillingly calm. "I will not let you destroy it in 30 minutes because you think you are above the laws that keep this city functioning. You have made a choice today, Tiffany. Now, you will live with the consequences of it. You are going to apologize to this officer, not because I told you loudly, but because you need to understand that your name does not make you a better person than the man whose job is to keep these roads safe." Officer Miller stood perfectly still, watching the power dynamic dissolve. He had seen many things in his career, but he had never seen a parent choose the integrity of the law over the protection of their child. It was a pivot point. The air felt lighter, yet charged with the gravity of the moment. Tiffany looked at the officer, then at her father, then at the sleek, expensive car that suddenly felt like a cage. The illusion that her name was a passkey had just been shattered, replaced by the harsh, honest light of reality. And for the first time in her life, the silence that followed didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. The news of the traffic stop didn't stay on the asphalt of 4th and Main. In an age where every smartphone is a potential broadcast station, the confrontation had already been uploaded, shared, and dissected by thousands before Arthur's black SUV had even pulled away. The video, Tiffany's own recording, became a viral flashpoint. It wasn't just a video of a spoiled girl getting a ticket. It was a mirror held up to a society exhausted by the concept of unearned status. The comments section became a living, breathing courtroom. People who had spent their lives being ignored by the powerful suddenly had a voice, and they used it to strip away the varnish of the Sterling name. "We are all the same in the eyes of the law," one comment read, pinned to the top of the feed with thousands of likes. It was a sentiment that resonated across demographics, from the blue-collar workers in the neighborhood to the retired professionals watching from their living rooms. Tiffany, who had spent her entire existence curating a persona of effortless superiority, was now the punchline of a national joke. She was no longer just the billionaire's daughter, she was the Ferrari girl, the symbol of everything wrong with the entitled elite. For the first time, she wasn't just being judged by her father or an officer, she was being judged by the collective conscience of a country that was tired of watching people buy their way out of reality. The humiliation was visceral. Her social media accounts, once filled with pictures of exclusive parties and designer labels, were flooded with the cold reality of public opinion. She tried to delete the comments. She tried to issue a statement claiming she was misunderstood, but the internet, as it often does, remains unimpressed by excuses. The more she fought to reclaim the narrative, the more the public dug into the history of her family's influence, uncovering every corner where that influence had been quietly used to bypass the rules. In the boardrooms of her father's empire, the impact was immediate. Investors started asking questions. Shareholders, who previously valued the Sterling name for its connections, now see it as a liability. The Sterling shield wasn't just broken, it had become radioactive. Tiffany was seeing the machinery of power turn against its own owners. The connections she thought would protect her were now distancing themselves as fast as possible, disenchanted that the public's rage would stain them as well. It was a lesson in the fragility of a reputation built on sand. Tiffany had operated under the assumption that her wealth insulated her from the consequences of her character. She learned in the harsh glare of public scrutiny that wealth might buy comfort, but it couldn't buy character, and it certainly couldn't stop the world from demanding it. She was no longer a person of influence. She was a cautionary tale. And as she sat in the silence of her penthouse, looking out at the city that had once bowed to her name, she realized that the world hadn't changed. Only her position in it had. The public didn't hate her for being wealthy. They hated her for believing that her wealth made her exempt from being a decent human being. The storm of public outrage eventually receded, leaving behind a silence that was far more deafening than the noise. Tiffany was no longer the girl who could command the room with a snap of her fingers. She was the girl who had to learn how to exist in a world that didn't care about her last name. In the penthouse that now feels less like a palace and more like a gilded cage, she began to sift through the wreckage of her own identity. It started with a simple, painful realization. Every friend who had surrounded her, every socialite who had praised her sharp tongue, had disappeared the moment the Sterling name became a liability. The people she thought were her inner circle were merely orbiting her father's influence. When the influence shifts, they drift away like debris in a tide. She was truly alone, and for a girl who had never known a day without an entourage, the solitude was a brutal teacher. She began to spend her nights not at exclusive lounges, but walking the quiet streets of the city. She will walk past the hardware store on 4th and Main, the place where the collapse had begun. She would see Elias Crow, the store owner, closing up shop with the same deliberate, dignified motions he had always used. He wasn't a victim, he was a survivor who had remained standing while she had fallen. Watching him from the shadows, she felt a profound sense of shame, not because she had been caught, but because she finally understood the weight of the man she had tried to diminish. She started volunteering at a local community center, not for the cameras, not for the rehabilitation photo op, but because she had nowhere else to be. She found herself working alongside people who held jobs that she had once considered beneath her notice. She learned the names of the customer staff, the volunteers, and the people who came in looking for resources. For the first time, she was being looked at not as Arthur Sterling's daughter, but as just another person trying to do the work. The awakening was slow and agonizing. Every day was a confrontation with her own previous version, the arrogant, entitled, blind girl who thought the world owed her a front-row seat. She began to recognize the subtle cues of human connection that she had missed in her rush to be somebody. She saw that kindness wasn't a weakness, but a currency, and she had spent her life bankrupt. She eventually requested a meeting with Officer Miller. She didn't want a reduction in her sentence, and she didn't want an apology tour. She just wanted to ask him, "How did you stay so calm when I was being so cruel?" Miller looked at her. His eyes lacked the judgment she had grown to fear. "Because I knew that your anger wasn't about me, Tiffany. It was about you. And I knew that eventually you'd have to live with yourself. I was just holding the mirror." That was the moment the internal transformation took root. She wasn't just doing the time. She was reflecting on the crime. And for the first time, the Sterling name felt less like a heavy burden and more like a starting line for a life she finally had the courage to build for herself, one honest interaction at a time. Arthur Sterling did not return to his office the day after the traffic stop. He withdrew to his private study, a room lined with books that spoke of law, ethics, and the complex machinery of power, books he had studied his entire life, but, as he now realized, had rarely been allowed to govern his own home. He sat in the dark, the quiet broken only by the ticking of an antique clock, a sound that felt like a relentless reminder of the time he had lost in building a legacy that was currently unraveling. He wasn't mourning the loss of his daughter's reputation, nor was he worried about the headlines. He was mourning the realization that he had played a part in the erosion of her character. For years, he had operated under the delusion that he was building a protective cocoon around his family, shielding them from the harsh realities of the world. He had mistaken access for love and influence for guidance. Every time he made a call to fix a mistake Tiffany had made, he had effectively taught her that the rules were optional. He had been the architect of her arrogance, and now he was forced to be the demolition crew. His staff, seasoned professionals who had navigated his political career through decades of turbulence, were waiting for a command, a PR strategy, a legal maneuver, anything to blunt the impact of the viral video. But for the first time in his career, Arthur gave no orders. He watched the news reports, the debates, and the social media firestorm with a detachment that unnerved those around him. He saw the anger directed not just at Tiffany, but at the entire class of people he represented. He realized that the anger was justified. He thought of the store owner, Elias Crow, and the countless others like him, people who worked, who followed the rules, and who had every reason to be disgusted by the Sterlings. He felt a profound sense of responsibility. He realized that his power had not been a gift to be used. It was a debt to be repaid, and he had been defaulting on that debt for years. The next morning, he made a decision. He didn't call the commissioner, he didn't call his lawyer. He sat down and wrote a personal letter to the police department and to the general public, promoting that his daughter's actions were a reflection of a failure in his own leadership. He didn't ask for leniency, he asked for accountability. It was a letter of resignation from the board of directors of his foundation, a move that shocked his peers but was the only path that allowed him to look at himself in the mirror. His legacy, he concluded, wasn't the empire he had built. It was the daughter he had failed to raise. He had spent his life fighting for control, only to realize that the only thing he truly needed to control was his own integrity. He had spent his life trying to shape the city while failing to shape his own family. As he signed the resignation papers, the weight didn't lift, it shifted. It was now the weight of an honest man, and for the first time in decades, it felt like he could finally breathe. He had decided that justice was not an obstacle to his life, it was its foundation, and if that meant over, then so be it. The final act of a life lived in the shadow of entitlement is not a grand speech or a dramatic gesture. It is the quiet, persistent work of making things right. For Tiffany Sterling, redemption didn't come in a courtroom. It came in the grocery store aisles, in the community center volunteer shifts, and in the small, honest moments where she had to look people in the eye and acknowledge her past without the buffer of a last name. She realized that the price of her redemption was the very thing she had tried to discard, her own vulnerability. To be seen as a human being, she first had to stop being a caricature of wealth. She continued her community service long after the court-mandated hours expired. She wasn't seeking forgiveness. She was seeking a way to be useful, to balance a leader that had been in the red for over 2 decades. The people who once whispered about her behind her back eventually stopped. They didn't embrace her, but they allowed her to be there. And for Tiffany, that was more than enough. Her father, Arthur, walked a similar path. He became a fixture at city council meetings, not as a kingmaker, but as a citizen. He listens more than he speaks. He used his remaining resources to fund small, local initiatives, programs that didn't carry his name, programs that were focused on the quiet, essential work of lifting up the community he had once ignored. He and Tiffany began to meet for coffee on Tuesday mornings, the same time he used to spend in high-level strategic meetings. They didn't talk about politics or influence. They talked about the world they were seeing now, the one they had missed while they were busy looking down at it from the top. The story of the Sterlings didn't end with a headline. It ended with a quiet shift in the city's rhythm. The hardware store on 4th and Main stayed open, its display shelf well-stocked, its owner still standing with the same steady, unhurried dignity. When people pass by, they don't talk about the billionaire who was humbled. They talk about the day a line was drawn, and for the first time in a long time, it held firm. Justice, in the end, isn't just about the verdict delivered by a gavel. It is about the choice we make when we realize that our past does not have to be our future. Tiffany and Arthur Sterling learned that the most powerful thing you can do with your name is to stop using it as a shield and start using it as a signature, a promise to be better, to be present, and to be decent. The video of the traffic stop is still out there, floating in the digital ether, but it's not just a record of a moment of humiliation. It's a record of the moment a life began to change. For those who watch it, let it be a reminder: privilege is a test, and character is what remains after the test is over. If you believe that no one is above the law and that every choice carries a weight, then remember the Sterlings, not for who they were, but for who they decided to become when the world stopped granting them passes. The gavel has come down, the cameras have turned away, but the work, the real, hard, beautiful work of being human is only just beginning.